Good morning, everyone. It's a little early here in Brooklyn, but the show must go on. My name is Joost. I'm going to be talking a little bit about video games and the future of entertainment. I'm going to be doing that in the next 20 minutes or so, and I'll try to integrate some of the questions that pop up along the way. At the same time, we have about 40, 50 slides, so I hope you've had some coffee. I have my own right here, ready to go. So let's start from the top. First things first, it's of course the question is like, who am I? But why should I be talking about these things? I spent my career sort of I'm in the third part of a trilogy, I guess. I started as an academic. I did a PhD on the topic of video games, of social exchange, and games as a form of communication. I'll get into that in a moment. But that was a fascinating experience where I got to look into the games and play and sort of the history behind all of that in a way that didn't really exist. There's no curriculum for that. So I was able to tailor my own sort of academic trajectory there. Then to pay for all that education, I worked as an analyst, which then eventually led to the second component, which was founding a company called Superdata. So after observing some changes in the market, as the industry moved towards a digital format and as free to play became a more common model for revenue, for instance, things started to change and that needed to be monitored, measured, benchmarked, and that's where we built a business. We sold that business a few years ago to a research firm called Nielsen, spent some time there integrating it. And then after that, I rolled out of it right before the pandemic really took hold here in Brooklyn in the US. And since then, I've been investing and advising and working on a few projects, one of which is, interestingly, is a book I wrote. I teach at NYU still, as I have been for the last 9-10 years. And my curiosity really is driven by a single thing, which is, how is it that we talk about games as this massive industry, and it always seems to remain on the fringes? It's always on the side, and perhaps because of that reason, there isn't really any kind of disciplined, rigorous, empirical discussion around it. Like, what does it mean when games are made for profit? How does that impact how we design things? And how do you build a career around that? How do we innovate? How do we create competitive advantages for ourselves? And all those types of questions are fascinating to me across the creative industry's landscape. But while we ask those questions in newspapers and how ownership impacts, editorial boards, or while we look at the movie industry and say, well, Netflix entry in Hollywood impacted movie making in this way or another, nobody really looked at it in gaming. So as part of my class at NYU, I wrote the book and spent a lot of time looking at the data sets, and some of that I will share with you today. From the top, in my mind, I'm going to give you a three-piece talk here in the next 15, 20 minutes, and it starts with numbers, right? So let's just look at the high-level thing. From a rudimentary standpoint, the games industry has exploded in size, which I'm sure is part of the interest that we all share in joining Gamescom, as always. One of my favorite conferences in the year. And not just because it's in a cool place and it's a bunch of cool people, but it's also because the industry's been growing, right? It's a $3 billion person audience, and it's coming up on $200 billion in revenue. The numbers have accelerated and grown to the point where we're looking at this incredible progression in a way that music and movies have not. And so the large nature and really the size of things, I think fundamentally also changes how games are made. The obvious question, of course, in the last 18 months has been, well, okay, that's cool, but isn't that because of COVID, right? Didn't it lead to incredible growth in the industry? The fact that we're all stuck at home with our families, as much as we love them, you can't possibly talk to your mom that many hours in the day. And so you find amusement elsewhere. And so a load of games and a load of publishers really saw a spike, in some cases, 20% or more of, acyclical growth coming in because of the pandemic. We're all stuck at home, and it's one way for us to connect. Yes, it's true that COVID and the pandemic and the lockdown have in aggregate accelerated the industry, but that's not the only driver, right? The industry had been growing this whole time. One of the reasons we see this incredible growth in the games industry is that it is very different in its mindset with regards to changes. right? So music and video indicated here, you see two different things, right? The music is very, very hesitant to adopt digitalization, right? If you take a comparison of digital and physical sales, and you'll notice for music that, yes, in 2012, they kind of started adopting it, and that's where digital became bigger, but that still isn't really where the money is at, right? It's really only been in the last 2 years that streaming and music online has really grown. And that has everything to do with executives and decision makers and IP holders saying, no thanks, that's scary, piracy is bad, blah, 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 right? Video the same way, like it was, of course, in many ways, a big turnaround with Netflix and other streaming platforms, especially in recent years with HBO Max and Disney Plus. But also, you see that delay in adoption. Games has both of those things, but both early and fast did it adopt to digitalization, and as a result, it benefited in growth, both in height and in width. So one perspective on the games industry then, in terms of overall numbers, and I realize that the slides might be a little too dense here. I'll be happy to share them if they're not available through Gamescom or otherwise. What we see is a transition from a physical product-based business model to a service-based business model, which really means to say is that instead of buying a disc at the store, now I just go online and download the thing either for money or for free, and then I get monetized over time. And that's a big difference, right? So while the product-based business continues to do well, especially in the last few years when we see the launch of new consoles coming out, but lots of new titles to go with it. It's really the service-based revenue that's been driving growth in the industry. Think of mobile, think of PC, think of Steam, all these other platforms that we have really seen bloom in the last couple of years. So that's where games now become what they would think in economic terms as assets, rather than commodities that you can sell and kind of exchange. It's really about having a property and evolving it and iterating over time, creating, increasing the value of it. What's interesting about that to me, and this is just one way of explaining that, is that in spite of all this growth, in spite of all this innovation, I would argue, the world really hasn't, the world of adults hasn't really accepted games as a serious category. You see here, for instance, with the US Department of Commerce, yes, it's been up, 90% year over year. It's been a great year in 2020 across the board, but we're still going to lump it in with other categories, right? Never mind that pleasure boats and aircraft have their own category, motion picture theaters, pets, all discrete categories in economic sense. Games, we'll just lump them over there, and it's not so much to chastise them as much as to say, in the mind of a lot of people, games don't really deserve or exist in their own unique category. And I think that that's a mistake, right? The problem really is that games and play is such a universal instinct that for us to ignore that on a grand scale, I think is detrimental. And then particularly in the context of a large accelerated growth cycle, we cannot think that, oh, well, if there's now, instead of 2 game publishers, there's 20 of them, it's going to just be 10 times the size. No, as the industry increases in size, as it becomes a popular form of mainstream entertainment, right, moving away from the fringes and more into the center of what we do on a daily basis, the actual character and how the industry ticks changes as well. And so I borrow here from a colleague, Mr. Anderson, more is different. As the industry increases in size, it changes in its nature and its character. So that's sort of the number-based background to it. What excites me then with regards to how people in the games industry, whether that's the creators of games or whether it's the consumers of games, it's really about the mindset, right? The flexibility and the willingness to try new things. And so we see that first and foremost sort of represented in the fundamentals of what games really mean. And in a very succinct way, I've always thought of games as sort of they provide epistemic access to a much larger universe. So for the same reason that the Olympic Games in sort of ancient Greece were sort of surrounded by zodiac signs, and you would be running or throwing a javelin to honor the gods, it would appease the gods, and it would give us access to this much larger sort of meta universe that governed our physical universe. Backgammon in the same way is styled after the cosmos, right? And so a very simple way to put that is that in a culture where you have a sexagesimal counting system, where people don't count to 10, but they count to 6, and where people are nomadic and they travel around in tents, there's different principles about what is and isn't safe, right? It's better to be in a group. It's a bad idea to be out there by yourself alone. And so backgammon, in a sense, incorporates some of those things. And of course, always going to rely on this random factor of inshallah, like God willing, there is an element of chance, and that is sort of a microcosm of the universe. And so, in my mind, we've seen over the centuries this universal instinct towards play and wanting to engage in games, not so much as a as a tool that tells me in my own experience something about the world, but as something that we share together, right? And these ideas, the ideologies that frame and structure these games, whether that's backgammon or whether that's chess, they of course have their own ideas woven into them. And so this is a bit of a mockery, of course, but we all understand that the queen in the game of chess is worth more than a bishop and more than a pawn, right? Expressions teaches as much, but those are the rules. And so we are confronting, in other words, a hierarchical monarchy infused game structure. And I think that that's in many ways it tells you something about what the world looks like, right? It's trying to tell you a little bit. As my own experience as a Dutchman moving to New York, and I see here my slides are a little dodgy, but whatever. I moved to the US 2 weeks before September 11, and so it was very interesting, to see that experience firsthand. I could see the smoke from my window at the time, and it's and here's this large geopolitical conflict, right, that has these enormous ramifications, and these things impact our lives. Like, how do we make sense of that, right? And so I've always in the same way that chess tells us about monarchies and social structures and ideologies, video games have this purpose, I believe, to give us epistemic access to ideas that we can't really grasp or can't really play out in daily life. And so things like Call of Duty and Battlefront, those are all titles that allow us to kind of unnerve the irritation that comes with being governed by and being impacted by these large, big deal world events without having any feedback loop. It can't impact them in return, right? And so there's no agency for me there. So now I figure that out in a game setting, and that is, of course, in many ways just one example. There's also things like the presentation of self in a digital environment, but we worry and wonder about, like, how do we come across? What do we look like? I'm sure we've all secretly sort of flipped through all of the possibilities of Zoom backgrounds over the last year and a half, trying to figure out like what communicates best who I am to the people that are listening. You see my house. Like, I mean, look, I could sit in my office, it would be boring. So, you're aware of that to some degree. Games allow us to really play with that, right? Sort of this ludic identity where we think about ideas like, what does that look like? Who do I want to be? If I could be this hero in this sci-fi universe, what would I look like? But am I more of a stealth fighter? Am I more of a sniper? Am I more of an assassin? Where does that go? And then, of course, that kind of thinking of banding together, having this online community of people that you know but don't really know because you just know their handle and you're part of a team. Those are all practices and premises that I think feed together really well in some of the manifestations that we see today, right? So the meme stocks around AMC and GameStop, for instance, is a really interesting phenomenon of a relatively young tech savvy generation kind of trying to game the system, trying to figure out what to do with and make it work to their benefit. It stands in contrast, of course, then very much to the mindset that you find in traditional media, where clearly no one thought to tell Kim Kardashian's crew that maybe you shouldn't start handing out Pepsis and put yourself at the center of some like social conflict. Like, maybe that's inappropriate, or maybe spending $1.8 billion on some video app that nobody asked for, and like Moses coming down the mountain. Maybe that was a bad idea and you lost a lot of money. Maybe making Magic Leap for some $3-4 billion amount only to have nothing to show for it. Maybe those are bad ideas. Maybe there is different ways that we can now deal with technology. And so the mindset in conventional consumer electronics, technology, and media and entertainment businesses tends to be very much like, we do it in secret in a lab and then we'll wow and surprise you once it's done. That world is perhaps over, right? I think the flexibility is a little different. And we see that represented in game companies like, for instance, Valve. Valve is known for its unique take on a lot of things, but one of them is, this notion of you are free to go about and identify problems and then address it with your colleagues and then work on them together. And so it's a very open, flat hierarchy. There's no structure between people. It's really like you do what you want to do. Like, you are held accountable of sorts, but that's a big source of its innovation and part of what things like Steam and the success of Steam come from. In another world, so if Valve is in the PC business, then of course Supercell is in mobile, not one but $4 billion franchises coming out of one company that's a few hundred people, all at least initially very seasoned creatives. Their idea was like, look, we hold ourselves accountable. We celebrate the failures because we learn from them, and then while we have access to the CEO, like it's really up to us. If we're not being told what to do, we decide, and that it's a sort of peer-reviewed structure. Those are all ways of thinking, not about games in terms of like how do I make the biggest, baddest, best-looking thing. It's also like what does the organization around it look like so that we can really achieve these goals. And it unnerves some of the myths, right? So it's so easy to think in these narratives of like, well, the economy goes forward, always going up, and out with the old, in with the new. And so when mobile came around, of course, console was immediately challenged because finally now, console gaming is dying. Wired would have you believe, CNN would have you believe, all these things. And you say, well, is that really the case? Is it true that one bad console like the Wii U is going to immediately lead to the demise of dedicated gaming hardware? Well, not so much, right? If you look at the ability of these large companies to innovate and kind of rally to these new things, it's always been a source of inspiration to see these large companies, even like Sony, being able to adapt to change. And so you see here on the left, digital content is roughly 2/3 of their income. They did that on purpose, of course, because they realized that the business around selling discs sort of ended. We got to move into a different direction. That has allowed them then not just to make some money, of course, but to break the cycle that you see in the graph to the right. Every time a new hardware device comes out, a consumer electronics company basically goes into the red, right? And you see that immediate decline that follows a few quarters after a new console drops. And for the first time in its history, you see the PlayStation then have a quarter after the launch of a new console, and they're in black, right? The numbers are up, not down. And that has everything to do with Sony's ability to adjust to a digital environment. And that type of thinking, I believe, is a big piece of the reason why you see so much success in the games industry today. That brings you to the third piece, and I'm going to go relatively quick here. For me, the creators and the consumers in the games industry, because of that mindset and because of the incredible momentum behind it, of course, present somewhat of a vanguard, somewhat of a first mover kind of audience for creative industry. They're willing to try and kind of look for opportunities everywhere, especially in the context of large big tech firms coming in. We've seen the news over the last year and a half of all these big companies trying to move into gaming, all these announcements. You have Google Stadia, and now Amazon is doing Luna, and that, there's all these different devices and these subscription services, and they're trying to eke in, and they do that in part because they know that that's where their audience is, that they're going to need for a broader future universe. So you have big tech very interested. Then of course you have platform wars left and right, because it used to just be a few, right? You used to have Sony, Nintendo, and of course then Microsoft later on. Now we have many more digital storefronts, and we have all these platforms, and you see then this tension between, on the one hand, Tim Cook, and the other one, Tim Sweeney from Epic Games, Apple versus Epic, as the lawsuit was called. You have to wonder, like, how is it going to impact? Like, the economic circumstance is different now. It's no longer just three incumbents, and they each kind of have their corner of the universe. It's much more of a wild west than ever before. It's very disruptive nature. And so you see then things that are starting to change, right? It used to be a terrible idea to make a movie out of a gaming property, right? The first Mortal Kombat, I've watched it a few times. It's sort of campy and fun, but it's not really, highbrow cinematography. From a business model perspective, you see, or from a revenue and profitability perspective, you do see that in the last 10 years, games and game-based movies start to become profitable, right? And so I'm thinking of World of Warcraft, of course. We have the Angry Birds movies. Pokemon is always a big example here too. But a lot of the mindset around what should work as movies and sort of more conventional forms of entertainment basing on games, that has changed in an economic sense, right? And so you then instantly start to see also, these graphs they lack a little bit. So my apologies for that. So you see here the budgets for these companies. All of a sudden, now we don't have filmmakers borrowing game IP. We now have these digital platforms, these big distributors trying to allocate a percentage of several $billions in currency towards making games. And so Netflix has been hiring people, Amazon's been doing the same, Apple is. And so you have to wonder, it's like, now we have these large companies coming in. Are we at the start of another transition of the game industry. Now that it's mainstream and you have these big players, how is it going to impact the universe around us? So one quick example is here with Facebook. It makes most of its money from advertising. So you see that all the way up to late 2020 here, and then all of a sudden it jumps to $885 million in the last quarter of last year, and it has everything to do with its success in VR. Right, all of a sudden that starts to take off. They're starting to figure out the device, and that has something from a strategic point to do with, of course, people warming up to the technology, but also the technology becoming more interesting. And so, on the long term, that's going to be a transition towards a new platform. But these are the companies that are going to impact in a big way, of course, how the world looks. So that leaves us as game creators, I think, some really interesting places where they cannot go, right? So, and particularly with regards to how money is made, I think revenue models are a very fertile ground for this. And because games are now mainstream, we now have all this opportunity. So one of them is subscription. Having steady, regular, predictable income is incredibly valuable, gets you a higher valuation as a publicly traded firm. At the same time, it also gives you a lot of cash flow on the long term, so that you can continue to build and iterate on your vision. And of course, both titles and publishers and platforms are moving in this direction. Game Pass has done really well for Microsoft and is a big key driver of the success there. And so that creates a new model. But if I'm not paid on a per unit basis, and if I'm not monetizing by microtransactions, what does it mean when I get subscription? Is that beneficial to me? Like, how should I think about this as a game creator? Same thing, of course, with advertising. Advertising has been this, indirect revenue has been this thing that's been going on for a long time. It doesn't really work. There wasn't enough critical mass. There was no real marketplace where you could buy and sell ad space. There was no inventory in that sense. That's changed now too. You see companies like Publicis and WPP dedicating teams to figuring out, like, hey, how do we play a part in this? And then banner ads start to show up in League of Legends, right? The esports is a manifestation of this, of course, where we want brands to participate in some way. And that's going to change what those games look like. Of course, another one in this context is then user-generated content. But Roblox really killing it again this week with earnings, allowing people to make games and keep a piece of that and make some money off it. That's a really fascinating piece. It's a form of expression, but also now I can make a little bit of money. That changes dramatically what the game looks like. And at the far end, we see blockchain gaming. I've been working on this quite a bit over the summer as well. This idea that you could exchange your in-game characters for cryptocurrency and then sell them. That's a fascinating thing. So you see in Southeast Asia and places like Singapore, where people, not just contribute to their usual monthly income, but replace their monthly income. Instead of being a taxi driver, now they're playing Axie Infinity. And so there's a big question, like, okay, what does that look like? Is that a storm in a glass of water? Is that a statistical outlier, or is that the shape of things to come? And how did that impact and redistribute the energy that we put into game creation? So those are some of the areas. Ultimately, big tech is a big thing. Revenue innovation is another thing, but really it comes down to the players. Like where our mind should be as an industry is how people play. So a very quick succession, I'll show you a few here. So this is my little family here in Brooklyn. Me always getting my ass handed to me in Mario Kart. I cannot beat the 8-year-old. I'm sorry, I apologize. If that means I lose my game industry professional card, that's fine. But that's how it is. But that's how we play, right? We sit together and we go to places like, I guess this is coincidentally Gamescom, but so where we go and hang out together, right? It's playing, but also hanging out with others that share the same thing and share the same enjoyment. Or whether that's the Pokemon, days out there where we all meet on a field. This is pre-COVID, obviously, but this is an instinct that people share. I spent the summer of 2016 explaining to journalists and people everywhere, saying, what Pokemon was as a phenomenon, because all of a sudden thousands of people were out there running around having a good time, and that was really the big deal, right? That was such a fun thing to do, and everybody participated in it, and it was overwhelmingly clear that this is something that we all share. In a Corona context, of course, we then took online. We find ways online to then negotiate and hang out and spend time and interact in ways that we would otherwise do in the real world, because we can't do it in the real world right now during the lockdown. So that's where we find a new manifestation. And of course, that leads to a great big success for a lot of these games. And if we're not playing, then we're watching, right? So this is, I believe it's Fortnite. This is some party. All the kids get sort of jumped thrown into a single room together, and like they just take turns playing, and the rest of them is watching. Like, how is it going? And the little kids in the front are learning from the bigger kids in the back. This is how we like to play. Like, we like to watch other people too, and then you can professionalize it in a big scale. This is 2 blocks from my house, the Barclays Center in Brooklyn. Yeah, this massive event with all kinds of talent and like fanfare and glitter, but it creates a certain ceremonial appreciation, and certain shared ritual of like, look, I like this, you like this, let's all hang together and celebrate our mutual interests. And then of course you have that also now online in form of like the music industry getting really jiggy with the games industry. You see here Ariana Grande's Rift tour, but it's this online experience. You should check it out. It's fascinating. Like, how would you as an artist present yourself? You can't really rely on live performances right now, even though that's 80% of revenue for most musicians, because you can't really do tours at the same scale that you used to. So now they find these other ways to do it, and they find things like Fortnite to play online, to connect with their fan base online. And so it's an easy derivative of what we've known for a long time in the games industry. Of course, conventional spending, actual spending of money and time. Of course, I want to buy all the cool accessories. I want to have the one joystick that tells everybody what a cool person I am. Or perhaps it's that item that I can't really get my hand on unless I dedicate 100 hours of my time to slaughter this one demon, in a Path of Exile or some other game that is really geared towards grinding. How you spend time and resources really, of course, tells also the world about who you are, and so on. Which leaves me then with 2 last categories: creating. People want to contribute and create, put things into the world that they can share with others, and they really enjoy that, right? It's the Roblox story. But it goes much further than that, of course. It's here as an example of The Sims. One of the senior people at Maxis, the studio that publishes it, stated that amateur creators that for The Sims created roughly 7 times the inventory of in-game items than the professional game designers did, right? And so, in other words, there's no way that you can compete as a studio with the incredible ability to build items and cool new features. Better to curate it and to kind of have some guidelines than to spend all your money on building it yourself. Let them do the playing, let them do the creation part, and have fun at it, right? Like, give them some recognition of that. If we're creating things and we're also participating, and so we saw Twitch playing Pokemon, this sort of wild, chaotic experience of people participating all at the same time, issuing a single command to Twitch, and then ultimately, of course, even finishing the game. So, we want to be part of this synchronized, shared experience. That's a rudimentary form. You start to see the emergence of more dedicated, more developed things. For instance, Rival Peaks here by Genvid. Sort of this big brother. I can input what this character is going to do. We can all, connect to each other. Like, well, we vote that this person has to go build a fire or get some food or whatever. And so you start to have this sort of multiplayer voting system that's really interesting. And how do I get to determine things? And so participation takes on very different formats than we're used to. And then, of course, in the context of ownership and blockchain, we start to see this commoditization where you have this fractional ownership of things where I can, with my share in particularly, let's say, a card game or a comic book series, I can determine or partially influence how the narrative is going to play out, right? So it's not just, Bandersnatch where we have sort of a choose your own adventure. Then it's choose your adventure together with all these other people based on how much input you have on the game, which I think is a fascinating thing. And beyond that, of course, you can also start building passive income through owning a portfolio of in-game NFTs. If that's a little too acadabra for you, I totally understand it's early days, but you start to see this move towards ownership and trading on that ownership among gamers and the larger universe. So if those are 6 of the ways that people interact with games now, it's really the question about how we connect dots, right? And so game designers, I believe, live in the space between all of these things. How do we come up with something that's unique, right? And so Among Us is a really good example of like we're playing, we're socializing, we're watching. It leaves a lot of different opportunities for players to find themselves in the crevices between all these components. And how we think about this creatively, I think, is really the future of what entertainment's going to be look like. That leaves me with really the observation that if you want to talk more, I love this conversation purely because there's a lot to talk about here. So please read my book, subscribe. I'd love to hear your comments and criticisms as always. You know how to reach me. Thank you for your time.